I used to believe that the truth was like a lighthouse constant, bright, and impossible to miss if you were looking for it. But standing in the floral aisle of the Lakewood King Soopers on a crisp Sunday afternoon, I realized that for the last 4 years, I'd been sailing my daughter's life straight into a jagged reef, blinded by the very lights I thought were keeping us safe. My name is Walter Green. I'm 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 30 years making sure bridges didn't collapse and foundations stayed level. I like things that are structurally sound. I like plans, blueprints, and the quiet reliability of a well-built life. My own life had been exactly that until my wife, Sarah, passed away 5 years ago. Since then, my world had narrowed down to a few simple rituals, the most important of which was Sunday dinner at my daughter Michelle's house. The ritual always started the same way. I'd pull my Ford F-150 into the supermarket parking lot on Wadsworth Boulevard, grab a cart with a squeaky wheel, and head straight for the flowers. Michelle has her mother's eyes and her mother's love for red roses. If I showed up at her place in Highlands Ranch without a bouquet, it felt like the house was missing its soul. I was debating between a dozen long stems and a smaller, tighter arrangement when I felt a hand, cold and trembling, clamp onto my forearm. Walter Green, is that really you? I turned, expecting a casual greeting from a former colleague or a fellow church member. Instead, I found myself looking into the wide, panicked eyes of Linda Warren. Linda had lived next door to Sarah and me for 15 years. She'd seen Michelle grow from a scrape-knee tomboy into a stunning bride. She'd brought over more casseroles than I could count after Sarah died. But she had moved away 2 years ago to live with her son, and we'd lost touch. She was wearing a faded King Soopers apron, her silver hair escaping a mesh hairnet. She looked older, tired, and deeply troubled. Linda, it's been ages, I said, trying to summon a smile. I didn't know you were working here. She didn't return the pleasantry. Her grip on my arm tightened, her knuckles turning white against the sleeve of my flannel shirt. She leaned in so close I could smell the faint scent of checkout line sanitizer and stress. Walter, I've been praying I'd run into you. I didn't have your new number, and I didn't want to call and be the one to break it. But seeing you here, it's a sign. She looked over her shoulder toward the pharmacy counter as if someone were watching us. Your son-in-law, Brandon, he's been hiding something from you. Something terrible. A cold prickle of sweat broke out at the base of my neck. Brandon Coleman was the golden boy, a high-flying real estate agent with a smile that could sell a shack for $1 million. He treated Michelle like she was made of glass. He was the man I'd thanked God for every night because he'd stepped in to take care of my daughter when I couldn't. Linda, what are you talking about? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. Brandon's a good man. He's been going through a lot lately. His mother is sick. They're struggling with medical bills. Walter, listen to me, she hissed, cutting me off. Last Tuesday, he was here, right here in this store. But he wasn't alone. He was with a woman. A young woman, maybe 30, with long dark hair and clothes that cost more than I make in a month. She had this diamond bracelet on her wrist that caught the light every time she reached for something. They weren't just shopping, Walter. They were intimate. I felt the air leave my lungs. Intimate? Maybe it was a client, Linda. He's in luxury real estate. He has to wine and dine people. Linda shook her head slowly, her eyes brimming with a pity that made my stomach turn. I was at the register, Walter. I saw them. He had his arm around her waist, pulling her close. They were laughing about what kind of wine to buy for their anniversary dinner. And when I saw him, I couldn't help myself. I called out his name. I said, Brandon, it's Linda from next door. How's Michelle? She paused, and the hum of the grocery store freezers suddenly felt deafening. He looked me dead in the eye, Linda whispered. He didn't blink. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at that woman and said, I'm sorry. I don't know this woman, ma'am. She must have me confused with someone else. Then he paid for $200 worth of groceries, gourmet steaks, expensive champagne, and walked out like I was a ghost. I stood there, clutching the plastic wrap of the roses so hard the thorns started to bite into my palm. My mind was a chaotic mess of images. I thought of Michelle, my beautiful, selfless daughter, who had been pulling double shifts at the hospital for months. She'd told me money was tight because Brandon's mother, Edith, was in a specialized care facility for a failing heart. Michelle had even dipped into her own inheritance the $25,000 Sarah had left specifically for Michelle's future to help pay for Edith's surgeries. $200. I managed to choke out. On a Tuesday. He paid with a black card, Walter. No hesitation, Linda said, her voice trembling. And the way they looked at each other, that wasn't a business meeting. That was a couple who thought they were invisible. She squeezed my hand one last time before a manager called her name from the front. I'm sorry, Walter. I really am. But if it were my daughter, I'd want to know who was really sitting at my dinner table. She hurried away, leaving me standing in the middle of the floral aisle. I looked down at the roses. They were a deep, blood red, beautiful and vibrant, but now they felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of a lead casket. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last moment of peace I would have for a very long time. I paid for the flowers at a self-checkout, avoiding the human interaction I usually craved. My hands were shaking as I climbed into my truck. The drive to Highlands Ranch usually took 25 minutes, a scenic route through the rolling hills and the meticulously planned suburban sprawl. Today, it felt like a journey into a foreign land. I kept trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe Linda was confused. She was older. People change in 2 years. Maybe Brandon was working an undercover deal? No, that was the plot of a bad movie. Brandon was a realtor, not a spy. The reality was much simpler and much darker. As I pulled into their driveway, the sight of their house hit me like a physical blow. It was a beautiful 2-story colonial, pristine white with black shutters. It was the kind of house that screamed stability. But then I noticed the car in the driveway, a brand new silver Audi Quantum. Wait, Brandon had told me last month that they were thinking about downsizing to 1 car to save money for Edith's treatments. Where had the Audi come from? I walked to the front door, the roses in my hand feeling like a lie. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. Michelle stood there, looking exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that spoke of a woman who hadn't had a moment for herself in days. "Dad, you're here," she said, leaning in to hug me. She smelled like hospital soap and coffee. "And roses. You're the best." I hugged her back, tighter than usual. I felt the thinness of her shoulders. She was working herself to the bone. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. "Just tired, Dad. Another long shift. But Brandon's inside. He's making his famous risotto. He's been such a rock lately, honestly. I don't know what I'd do without him." She led me into the kitchen, and there he was, Brandon. He looked like he'd just stepped off the cover of a magazine. Perfectly groomed hair, a crisp white button-down with the sleeves rolled up to reveal a watch I hadn't seen before, a sleek, silver timepiece that looked like it cost more than my first house. "Walter, good to see you," Brandon said, stepping away from the stove to shake my hand. His grip was firm, his smile dazzling. "Sit down, have some wine. We're celebrating." "Celebrating what?" I asked, my eyes darting from his expensive watch to the high-end bottle of wine open on the counter. "I closed a big listing today," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Finally, things are turning around. We might even be able to move Edith to a better wing at the facility next month." Michelle beamed at him, her hand resting on his arm. The devotion in her eyes made my heart ache. She believed every word. She saw a hero where, according to Linda, there was only a predator. I sat at the table, the roses now in a vase between us. The house was filled with the delicious smell of garlic and parmesan, but all I could taste was the copper of my own fear. I looked at Brandon, really looked at him, and for the first time, I noticed a small smudge on his collar. It was faint, a pale pinkish red. Lipstick. It wasn't Michelle's color. She wore a sheer nude gloss for work. This was bold, expensive, and definitely not hers. I felt a roar of protectiveness rise up in my chest, a heat I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to reach across the table and demand to know who the woman in the grocery store was. I wanted to ask where the $25,000 had really gone, but I looked at Michelle tired. Fragile Michelle and I knew I couldn't just blow up her world without proof. Not yet. "So, Brandon," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I picked up my wine glass. "How is your mother doing? I've been meaning to go out to the facility and visit her." "Which one was it again?" "The one in Aurora?" Brandon's smile didn't waver, but I saw his pupils dilate for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of panic that only someone who had spent 30 years looking for structural cracks would notice. "Actually, Walter," he said, stirring the risotto with practiced ease, "they've moved her to a private wing, restricted visiting hours. Very high security because of the new equipment she's on, It's better if we coordinate a time together. I'll let you know when the doctors give the green light." He turned back to the stove, his back to me. Michelle was busy setting the table, humming a little tune, finally relaxing after her long shift. She had no idea that her husband had just lied to my face. I knew that facility. I'd researched it when they first mentioned it. They didn't have a restricted high-security wing for heart patients. I looked down at my plate, the realization hitting me like a physical weight. My son-in-law wasn't just cheating, he was running a con, and my daughter was the mark. I didn't know it yet, but by the time I walked out of that house tonight, I would have made a silent vow. I was going to find out exactly what Brandon Coleman was hiding, even if I had to tear down every beautiful wall of this house to find the rot underneath. What happened next changed everything, because as we sat down to eat, Brandon's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, and for a split second, the mask of the perfect husband slipped, revealing something cold, calculating, and utterly dangerous. The vibration of that phone against the granite countertop sounded like a rattlesnake in a quiet room. Brandon didn't jump, but the muscles in his jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He didn't pick it up immediately. He finished stirring the risotto, his movements suddenly mechanical, before wiping his hands on a tea towel and reaching for the device. He didn't look at the screen for more than a second, but it was enough. The color drained from his face, replaced by a forced, sickly sweet smile as he looked at Michelle. "Just the office, honey," he said, his voice a pitch too high. "That luxury listing on Merbaith. The buyers are being difficult about the inspection. I should probably take this in the other room." Michelle didn't even look up from her glass of wine. On a Sunday evening, "Brandon, you work too hard. Tell them it can wait until tomorrow." "I wish I could, babe," he said, already backing out of the kitchen, phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. "But you know how these high-end deals are. If you aren't available, muy bon bye, the commission evaporates. I'll be 5 minutes." He disappeared into the hallway, and a moment later, I heard the soft click of the office door closing. I looked at my daughter. She looked so small, sitting there, the steam from the risotto curling around her face. "He really does work a lot, doesn't he?" I asked, trying to sound casual while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Michelle sighed, a sound so full of weariness it made my throat ache. "He's doing it for us, Dad. Ever since Edith got sick, the stress has been incredible. The facility in Aurora, it's nearly $8,000 a month, and that's before the specialist fees. If Brandon wasn't closing these big deals, I don't know where we'd be." I took a slow sip of the wine. It was expensive, oaky, and felt like ash in my mouth. "And you, Michelle? You're picking up extra shifts at the hospital to help cover it?" "I have to," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "He's his mother's only child, Dad. I couldn't live with myself if we didn't give her the best care possible. Sarah Mom would have wanted us to help family." Hearing her use her mother's name to justify Brandon's lies felt like a serrated blade across my conscience. Sarah had been the most discerning woman I ever knew. She had a nonsense meter that could detect a lie from a mile away. I realized then, with a crushing sense of guilt, that I had failed to pass that trait on to our daughter. Or perhaps Michelle was just like me, she wanted to believe in the best of the people she loved. I remembered the day they met. It was only 6 months after Sarah's funeral. I was a wreck, and Michelle was trying to hold me together while her own world was falling apart. Brandon had come along like a burst of sunlight in a dark room. He was a junior agent back then, charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted to making Michelle smile again. I'd been so grateful to see her happy that I'd ignored the small things. The way he never quite looked me in the eye when talking about his past. The way he always seemed to have a crisis whenever a bill came due. The way he'd subtly encouraged Michelle to distance herself from her old college friends. I'd chalked it up to youth and ambition. I'd wanted him to be the man he claimed to be. Now, standing on the edge of the truth, I realized I'd been an architect of my own daughter's potential ruin. Brandon returned 10 minutes later, his face flushed. "All sorted," he declared, though he wouldn't meet my gaze. "Now, let's eat. Life is too short for cold risotto." The rest of dinner was a masterclass in performance art. Brandon told jokes, poured more wine, and spoke eloquently about the new wing at the care facility. He described the gardens, the state-of-the-art monitoring systems, and how Edith was finally starting to recognize him again on her good days. I watched his hands as he spoke. He didn't have the hands of a man who was struggling. His nails were manicured. That watch on his wrist, I recognized the logo now. It was a Tag Heuer. I knew enough about luxury goods to know that watch cost at least $3,000. If money was so tight that Michelle had to give him her inheritance, why was he wearing a car's worth of silver on his wrist? "You know, Brandon," I said, leaning back as Michelle went to get the dessert, "I've got some free time tomorrow. Why don't I drive out to Aurora? I'd love to see Edith, even if it's just through a window." Brandon stopped mid-cheer. His fork clattered against the china. "Oh, Walter, I wouldn't. Like I said, the new wing is very strict. They're dealing with a flu outbreak among the staff. No visitors for at least 2 weeks. It's for her safety." "I'm a retired engineer, Brandon. I know how to wear a mask," I pressed, my voice hardening. "Dad, don't be difficult," Michelle said, re-entering the room with a tray of lemon tarts. "Brandon's right. We have to follow the protocols. We'll all go together once the quarantine is lifted. Promise." I saw the smug flicker of victory in Brandon's eyes. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd handled the old man. I didn't say another word about it. I finished my tart, complimented the chef, and kissed my daughter goodbye. But as I walked to my truck, the cold Colorado air clearing the wine fuzz from my brain, I knew I wasn't going home. I pulled out of the driveway and drove 3 blocks away, parking under the shadow of a large oak tree. I turned off the lights and waited. My heart was racing. I felt like a criminal, spying on my own family. But the image of that lipstick on his collar and the way he'd lied about the facility kept playing on a loop in my head. 10 minutes passed, 20. Then, the garage door of the house opened. The silver Audi backed out. Brandon was alone. He didn't head toward the highway that led to Aurora. He headed toward downtown Denver. I followed him. I stayed 3 cars back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they cramped. He drove with confidence, weaving through the late-night traffic until he reached the Lodo district, an area known for expensive lofts and trendy rooftop bars. He parked in a private garage beneath a glass-walled high-rise. I pulled over to the curb across the street, my eyes fixed on the entrance. A few minutes later, he emerged from the elevator lobby. He wasn't alone. A woman met him at the glass doors. She was exactly as Linda had described, young, dark hair like silk, wearing a tailored cream-colored coat that looked like it belonged on a runway. As soon as the doors closed behind them, she threw her arms around his neck. Brandon didn't pull away. He didn't look like a man worried about his sick mother or his struggling finances. He picked her up, spinning her around, and then he kissed her a deep, lingering kiss that shattered whatever remained of my hope. I sat in the dark of my truck, the silence of the cabin suddenly suffocating. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to roll down the window. My daughter was at home, probably already in bed, setting her alarm for a come a.m. shift at the hospital so she could fund this man's double life. I grabbed my phone. I wanted to call her. I wanted to scream at her to get out of that house. But I stopped. If I called her now, Brandon would lie. He'd say it was a misunderstanding, a crazy client, or that I was losing my mind. Michelle would want to believe him. She needed to believe him. I needed more than a kiss in a lobby. I needed the paper trail. I waited until they went up to the lofts. Then I put the truck in gear. I didn't go home. I drove 40 minutes in the opposite direction, toward Aurora. The Pinewood Care Center was a squat, beige building that looked nothing like the state-of-the-art facility Brandon had described. There were no gardens, no high-security wings, just a flickering fluorescent sign and a lonely-looking receptionist behind a plexiglass shield. I walked inside, the smell of industrial cleaner and stale air hitting me like a physical punch. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, not looking up from her computer. "I'm here to see Edith Marshall," I said, my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. I'm a family friend." The woman frowned, typing something into her system. "Marshall? Edith?" "Yes, she's in the new heart care wing, the restricted one." The woman finally looked up, her expression a mix of confusion and pity. "Sir, we don't have a heart care wing. This is a basic assisted living facility, and we don't have an Edith Marshall registered here." I felt the floor tilt. "Are you sure? Maybe she's under Coleman? Her son is Brandon Coleman." She checked again, shaking her head. "No Coleman, no Marshall. We haven't had a new admission in 3 weeks." I walked out of that building and into the parking lot, the freezing wind whipping at my face, the $25,000, the monthly $8,000 fees, the double shifts. It was all a ghost. There was no sick mother. There were no medical bills. I leaned against my truck, gasping for air as the full scope of the betrayal settled over me. Brandon hadn't just cheated on my daughter. He had systematically bled her dry, using her grief and her love for family to fund a life with another woman. I looked at the dark horizon, the lights of Denver glowing in the distance. Brandon thought he was the architect of this lie. He thought he'd built a foundation so strong that an old man like me could never crack it. He didn't know that I knew how to find the weak point in any structure, and I was going to make sure that when his life collapsed, there wouldn't be a single brick left standing. But as I reached for my keys, I saw a black SUV pull into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the dark. The driver didn't get out. They just sat there, watching me. I realized then that Brandon might not be the only one with secrets. And I wasn't the only one watching. The headlights of the SUV were blinding, 2 white suns cutting through the freezing aurora mist. I shielded my eyes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. For a second, I thought it was Brandon. I thought he'd doubled back, realized I was following him, and decided to end this right here in a dark parking lot. But as the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out, I realized the silhouette was all wrong. He was shorter than Brandon, stockier, wearing a heavy tan car coat and a flat cap. He didn't approach me with aggression. He walked with the slow, measured pace of someone who had spent a lot of time waiting in the dark. "You won't find her in there, Mr. Green," the man said, his voice a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the cold air. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle of my truck. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The man stopped a few feet away, lighting a cigarette. The orange glow illuminated a face that looked like a crumpled road map, deep lines around the eyes, a jagged scar running through one eyebrow. "The name's Marcus. I'm a private investigator. And I know your name because I've been following the man you were following tonight." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado winter. "You're following Brandon? Why? Who hired you?" Marcus took a long pull of his cigarette, the smoke curling around his head like a ghost. "A former business associate of his. Seems your son-in-law has a habit of borrowing things that don't belong to him. Deposits for houses that never go on the market. Earnest money that vanishes into thin air. He's a slippery one, Walter. I've been on him for 3 months, and every time I think I've got him pinned, he slips through the cracks like grease." "He told us his mother was here," I said, gesturing toward the bleak building. "Edith Marshall. He said she was dying." Marcus let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Edith Marshall died 6 years ago in a state facility in Florida, Walter. Brandon hasn't had a living mother since before he met your daughter. That care facility story, that's his favorite play. It's the perfect empathy trap. Who's going to question a man trying to save his dying mother? It's the ultimate excuse for missing money and long nights away from home." The world felt like it was spinning off its axis. I reached out to the side of my truck to steady myself. If his mother is dead, then where is the money going? My daughter gave him $25,000. She's working 12-hour shifts to pay for a ghost. Marcus flicked his ash onto the pavement. "He's building a nest, Walter, but not for your daughter. That girl you saw him with tonight? That's Amber. She thinks he's a wealthy bachelor with a tragic past. He's been using Michelle's money to pay the lease on that high-rise loft and buy that Audi. He's not just cheating, he's migrating. He's slowly moving his entire life from Highlands Ranch to Lodo. Once the bank accounts are dry and the credit cards are maxed out in Michelle's name, he'll disappear. He's a liquidator, Walter. He liquefies people's lives and drinks the proceeds. I didn't know it yet, but Marcus was the only ally I had in a world that had suddenly become a house of mirrors. He reached into his coat and handed me a small, weathered business card. "I'm off the clock for my client tonight, but I don't like seeing guys like you get bled out. You want to save your daughter? Don't confront him. Not yet. A man like Brandon is like a cornered rat. He'll bite, and he'll bite hard. You need to be smarter than he is. You need to start looking at the foundations, engineer. Find out what's actually in your daughter's name." With that, he climbed back into his SUV and reversed out of the lot, leaving me alone with the smell of tobacco and the crushing weight of the truth. I drove home in a daze, the heater in the truck blasting, but I couldn't stop shivering. When I finally walked into my quiet house, the silence felt accusatory. I went to the small den where I kept my old files and sat at the mahogany desk Sarah had bought me for our 25th anniversary. I pulled out a photo album from the bottom drawer, the one from Michelle's wedding. I flipped the pages, my eyes stinging. There was Michelle, looking like an angel in white lace, and there was Brandon, looking every bit the proud, devoted husband. I looked at the photos of his side of the family. There were only a few friends, and a couple he'd introduced as his aunt and uncle from out of state. I remembered thinking it was odd that his parents didn't show, but Brandon had spun a heart-wrenching yarn about a bitter divorce and a mother who was too fragile to travel. Every red flag I'd ignored now burned like a flare in the dark. I spent the rest of the night digging through old emails and tax returns I'd helped Michelle with. My daughter was a brilliant nurse, but she'd always hated the numbers side of life. She'd handed the financial reins to Brandon completely, trusting him to manage their future. As I logged into the joint accounts I still had access to from when I helped them with their first down payment, my blood ran cold. The savings account was a graveyard. Thousands of dollars moved out in increments of hi, come, and bah, come just under the alert thresholds for most banks. The Edith Care Fund they'd set up, it was empty. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon kissing that woman in the lobby. The next morning, I met Michelle for lunch near the hospital. She was in her scrubs, her face pale, her hands shaking as she tried to unwrap a sandwich. "Dad, you look like you haven't slept," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Is everything okay? You seemed off at dinner last night." I looked at her, and for a second, the truth was right on the tip of my tongue. I wanted to tell her her husband was a monster. I wanted to tell her she was broke, but I remembered Marcus's warning. A cornered rat will bite. "I'm just getting old, sweetheart." I lied, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "Just thinking about your mom." "Listen, I was looking over some old tax stuff. I realized I never saw the updated deed for the house after you guys did that refinance last year." "Brandon said he handled it?" Michelle nodded vaguely. "Yeah, he took care of all the paperwork. He said it was better to put the house in a trust for Edith's long-term care, in case the state tried to come after our assets for her medical bills. He's so smart about that stuff, Dad. He's protected us." My heart stopped. A trust. In Brandon's world, a trust was likely just a way to strip Michelle's name off the one asset she had left. "And you signed the papers?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "Of course. He's my husband, Dad. Why wouldn't I?" She looked at me then, her brow furrowing. "Why are you asking all these questions? Do you not like Brandon? I thought you two were close." "I just want you to be safe, Michelle. That's all. I'm an engineer. I worry about the structure." She gave me a tired smile and squeezed my hand. "The structure is fine, Dad. We're going to get through this. Brandon says by next year, things will be back to normal." I watched her walk back into the hospital, her gait heavy with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. She was a soldier in a war she didn't even know she was fighting. I spent the afternoon following the trail Marcus had hinted at. I went to the real estate firm where Brandon supposedly worked, the Coleman Group, a boutique office in a trendy part of Cherry Creek. The office was beautiful, all glass, white leather, and high-end art. I walked up to the young woman at the reception desk. She looked like she'd been carved out of marble. "I'm looking for Brandon Coleman," I said. "I'm his father-in-law. I was hoping to drop off some papers." The woman's expression shifted from professional to confused. "Mr. Coleman? Brandon hasn't worked here in over 6 months, sir." The floor didn't just tilt this time. It collapsed. 6 months? Are you sure? He leaves for the office every morning." She checked her computer, her voice softening. "He was an independent contractor with us, but his license was suspended following an ethics investigation. Something about commingling funds. He hasn't been back since June." I walked out of that office and leaned against a concrete pillar in the parking garage. The lies were so vast, so interconnected, that I couldn't see the edges of them anymore. He'd been faking a job for half a year. He'd been going to work to spend time with Amber and spend Michelle's money. I pulled out Marcus's card. My fingers were trembling so much I almost dropped it. I dialed the number. "Marcus," I said when he picked up, "I need your help. I need to know where the rest of the money is, and I need to know about the trust he made my daughter sign." "Meet me at the diner on Colfax in an hour," Marcus said. "And Walter? Bring your checkbook. This is about to get very expensive and very ugly." I went to the diner, but as I sat in the back booth waiting for Marcus, I noticed a familiar silver Audi pull into the lot of a high-end jewelry store across the street. Brandon got out. He looked happy. He looked like a man without a care in the world. He walked into the store, and a few minutes later, he came out with a small, velvet-covered box. He opened it, and even from across the street, I could see the sparkle of a diamond necklace. He didn't put it in his pocket. He didn't look like he was bringing it home to Michelle. He tucked it into the glove box of the Audi and headed toward Lodo. What I found out in that diner an hour later didn't just break my heart, it turned me into someone I didn't recognize. Marcus sat down, slid a thick manila envelope across the table, and looked me in the eye. It's worse than we thought, Walter. He's not just moving his life. He's planning a final exit. And if we don't move in the next 48 hours, your daughter is going to wake up in a house she doesn't own, with a debt she can't pay, and a husband who never existed. The vinyl of the diner booth felt cold and cracked beneath my palms. Marcus didn't say a word as he watched me open the manila envelope. Inside was a collection of photocopied documents, bank statements, and a copy of the family trust Michelle had signed 2 months ago. I'm an engineer. I've spent my life reading complex schematics and blueprints, but as I looked at the legal jargon on those pages, I felt like I was trying to read a map of a minefield. Look at page 4, Walter, Marcus said, his voice low and steady. The section on succession and liquidation. It's a masterclass in predatory law. Brandon didn't just put the house in a trust for his mother's care. He named himself the sole trustee with unilateral authority to sell or encumber the property, and the beneficiary. It's not Edith Marshall. It's a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I felt the blood drain from my extremities. He's selling the house. He already has, Marcus said, leaning in. He's got a private buyer lined up an off-market cash deal. The closing is scheduled for tomorrow at noon. The second that money hits the shell account, it's gone. And so is he. He's already filed for an expedited passport for Amber. I found the application in a digital sweep of his laptop. They're not just moving to Arizona, Walter. They're going to Belize. I looked at the photos of the house. Sarah and I had helped with the down payment. I'd spent weekends there painting the nursery that never saw a baby. I'd planted the oak tree in the backyard that was now 15 feet tall. It was Michelle's sanctuary, her only piece of solid ground after her mother died. And Brandon was selling it out from under her like a piece of scrap metal. He's leaving her with nothing, I whispered. Worse than nothing, Marcus countered. He's spent the last 6 months opening business lines of credit in Michelle's name. Since she's the one with the high-paying, stable nursing job, the banks didn't blink. He's maxed out 3 cards and a signature loan. Total debt? Somewhere around $140,000. When he vanishes, the creditors won't go looking for a ghost in Belize. They'll come for the nurse in Highlands Ranch. I stood up, the chair screeching against the tile floor. I wanted to find Brandon and show him exactly what 30 years of building bridges had taught me about how to bring things down. But the open loop in my mind kept spinning. If I didn't stop this tomorrow, my daughter would be homeless and bankrupt by Monday. I have to tell her, I said. Now, tonight. You tell her tonight, and she confronts him, Marcus warned, standing with me. And if she confronts him, he triggers the wire transfer early and leaves on a midnight flight. You need him at that house tomorrow morning. You need him feeling safe. You need him thinking the old man is still clueless. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest thing I'd ever have to do wasn't burying my wife. It was walking back into that house and pretending I didn't want to kill the man sitting at the table. I arrived at Michelle's house around p.m. The silver Audi was in the driveway, its polished surface mocking me. I stayed in my truck for 5 minutes, practicing my breathing, forcing my face into the mask of a doting, slightly senile father. When I walked inside, the scene was sickeningly domestic. Brandon was on the couch with his laptop, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Michelle was in the kitchen, still in her scrubs, heating up leftovers. "Hey, Dad," she called out, her voice bright but thin. "What brings you by?" "Just wanted to check in," I said, walking over to the couch. I caught a glimpse of Brandon's screen before he snapped it shut. A travel site, blue water, white sand. "How was the office today, Brandon?" He didn't even flinch. "Productive, Walter. Very productive. I think we're finally seeing light at the end of the tunnel with Edith's expenses. I might actually be able to take some time off soon, maybe take Michelle on a little getaway. She deserves it." He looked at her with such feigned adoration it made my skin crawl. He walked over, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed her neck. Michelle leaned into him, her eyes closing for a brief second of peace. "You're so good to me," she whispered. I had to look away. I walked to the window, staring out at the backyard. My hands were shaking, so I tucked them into my pockets. I felt the weight of Marcus's manila envelope in my truck, a paper bomb waiting to go off. "So, Michelle," I said, turning back. I was thinking, Since Brandon is doing so well and things are looking up, why don't we have a big celebratory breakfast tomorrow? My treat. I'll come over early, bring the works bacon, eggs, those fancy pastries you like from the bakery in Lakewood. Brandon's eyes flickered to the clock. Tomorrow morning? I've got a pretty big meeting at 10, Walter. Might be tight. Oh, come on, Brandon, Michelle urged. It's just breakfast. You said the meeting was just a quick sign-off anyway. Let's do it. It feels like forever since we've just sat down as a family. Brandon hesitated, then shrugged, his smile returning. Fine. Breakfast at Tam, home am. But I really do have to run by Chin, Bamui. I'll be here at Bamui, I said. I won't be late. I left shortly after, unable to stomach the sight of him touching her for a second longer. I drove back to my house and spent the night in the garage. I didn't sleep. I sharpened my tools, not the physical ones, but the psychological ones. I called Marcus and told him the plan. You're sure about this, Walter? Marcus asked. It's going to be a bloodbath. He didn't just steal money, Marcus. He stole her dignity. He stole her mother's legacy. A bloodbath is too kind for what he deserves. The next morning, the air was cold and brittle. I arrived at the house at Bamui sharp, just as promised. I brought bags of food, but hidden beneath the napkins and the pastries were the documents from Marcus. Brandon was already dressed. He was wearing a tailored suit, looking every bit the successful realtor. He was checking his watch every 30 seconds. Michelle was in a robe, looking happier than I'd seen her in weeks. The celebration was working. It had lowered his guard just enough. Smells great, Dad, Michelle said, helping me set the table. Only the best for my favorite daughter, I said. I looked at Brandon. And for the man who's worked so hard for this family. Brandon smiled, taking a seat. Thanks, Walter. I appreciate you saying that. I know we've had our frictions, but I really do want what's best for Michelle. I know you do, I said, sitting down across from him. That's why I brought a little something extra today. A graduation gift of sorts. Michelle looked confused. Graduation? From what? From the lies, I said. My voice had changed. The doting father was gone. The structural engineer was back. I reached into the bag and pulled out the first document. I slid it across the table toward Michelle. It was the death certificate of Edith Marshall from 6 years ago. Dad, what is this? Michelle asked, her brow furrowing as she read the name. Brandon's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. That's Brandon's mother, honey, I said, my eyes locked on Brandon's. The woman you've been paying $8,000 a month to keep alive. She died in Hang In Lair, Hai Mui, in Florida. Michelle's head snapped toward Brandon. Brandon? What is he talking about? You said we visited her through the glass. You told me the doctor said, he told you a story, Michelle. I interrupted. Just like he told you he was at the office when he was actually in a loft in Lodo with a woman named Amber. The same woman he's taking to Belize tomorrow afternoon on your dime. I slid the photos of him and Amber across the table, the kiss in the lobby, the diamond necklace. Brandon didn't explode. He didn't deny it. He just sat there, his face turning into a mask of pure cold stone. He looked at the photos, then at Michelle, and then at me. The charming guy was gone. In his place was the predator Marcus had described. You think you're so smart, don't you, Walter? Brandon said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. Brandon, tell him he's lying, Michelle sobbed, her hands shaking so hard she knocked over her orange juice. The liquid pooled on the table, soaking into the photos. Tell him this is a mistake. Brandon didn't even look at her. He looked at me and laughed. A dry, hollow sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It doesn't matter, Walter. You're too late. The papers are signed. The house is sold. The wire transfer is already in the queue. By the time you get a lawyer to look at this, I'll be sipping rum on a beach, and Michelle will be looking for a studio apartment she can't afford. He stood up, adjusting his cufflinks. It was a good run, Michelle. You really were the perfect mark. So desperate for someone to take care of you that you didn't notice I was stripping you bare. I stood up too. My heart was pounding, but my head was clear. You're right about one thing, Brandon. The papers are signed, but you forgot one very important detail about how I build things. Brandon sneered, heading for the door. I don't care about your bridges, old man. You should, I said. Because I didn't just go to a private investigator. I went to the bank, and I went to the district attorney's office, and I told them about the trust you created using a forged notary seal. Brandon stopped. His hand was on the doorknob. He turned back, his eyes narrowing. What? I know the notary you used, Brandon. Or rather, the one you claimed to use. He's been retired for 3 years. That trust isn't just predatory, it's a felony. And since you used the mail to send those documents to the buyer, it's a federal felony. The color didn't just leave his face this time. He looked like he was about to faint. You're bluffing, he whispered. Am I? I pulled out my phone, because Marcus is outside right now with 2 detectives from the fraud unit, and they aren't here for breakfast. But as I said the words, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house, the sound of a car slamming into something hard. I didn't know it yet, but the final exit Brandon had planned was about to get a lot more complicated. And someone else was at the door, someone we hadn't accounted for. The sound of twisting metal and shattering glass cut through the suffocating tension of the kitchen like a gunshot. Brandon's head whipped toward the window, his face a pale, sweating mask of terror. For a man who had spent years carefully constructing a life out of thin air, the sound of something actually breaking seemed to paralyze him. I didn't wait to see if he'd move. I surged past him, my heart hammering against my ribs, and threw open the front door. I expected to see the flashing lights of the fraud unit Marcus had promised. Instead, I saw a white Mercedes-Benz C-Class slanted across the driveway, its front bumper crumpled against the side of Brandon's pristine silver Audi. Steam hissed from the Mercedes radiator, curling into the cold morning air. The driver's side door of the Mercedes flew open, and a woman stepped out. She was young, her long dark hair disheveled, her eyes rimmed with red. She was wearing a tailored cream coat, the same one I'd seen in the Lodo lobby, but she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Brandon," she screamed, her voice cracking with a frantic, desperate edge. "Brandon, answer your goddamn phone." I felt Michelle push past me, her face a ghostly white. She stood on the porch, her robe fluttering in the wind, staring at the woman who had just wrecked her husband's car. "Who are you?" Michelle asked, her voice small and trembling. The woman stopped in her tracks, her gaze shifting from the house to Michelle. She looked confused, then defensive, her eyes darting to me and then back to my daughter. "I'm Amber. I'm Brandon's fiancée. Who the hell are you? His sister?" The world didn't just stop. It turned inside out. I felt Michelle sway beside me, and I reached out to steady her. Behind us, Brandon appeared in the doorway. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between the 2 women he had been playing like instruments in a symphony of lies. "Amber, what are you doing here?" Brandon hissed, stepping onto the porch. He tried to move toward her, his hands out in a placating gesture, but he looked like a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. "I told you I'd meet you at the airport at 2. I was handling the final family business." "You haven't answered me in 4 hours, Amber shouted, ignoring Michelle entirely. The movers showed up at the loft to take the furniture, and they said the lease wasn't just up. They said the cops had been there, asking about financial irregularities. "Brandon, what is going on? Where is the money for the house in Belize?" I didn't know it yet, but the business associate Marcus had mentioned wasn't just a disgruntled client. Brandon had been stealing from Amber, too. Michelle turned to look at Brandon. The tears were gone now, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that I recognized from my own mirror during the hardest years of my life. She looked at the woman in the driveway, then at the man she had called her husband, and finally at the diamond necklace sparkling around Amber's neck. "That necklace," Michelle said, her voice eerily calm. "It's beautiful. Brandon told me he was buying a gift for his mother's specialist, to thank him for the surgeries." Amber's hand went to her throat, her fingers clutching the diamonds. "His mother? Brandon's mother has been dead for years. He told me he bought this to celebrate our new life. He said he'd finally broken free from his toxic, controlling ex-wife who was trying to bleed him dry for alimony." Michelle let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Ex-wife? We're still married, Amber. We were supposed to be saving for a family. We were supposed to be building a future. Married?" Amber's face went from pale to a livid, blotchy red. She looked at Brandon, who was slowly backing away toward the garage. "You told me the divorce was finalized in Reno 6 months ago. You showed me the papers." "Forged," I chimed in, stepping forward. I felt the cold air filling my lungs, giving me a strength I hadn't felt since I was 30. "Just like the family trust he tried to use to sell this house. Just like the medical bills and the care facility reports. He's a printer, Brandon. He doesn't build anything. He just prints out the life he wants and hopes no one checks the ink. Brandon's mask finally disintegrated. The charming realtor, the devoted husband, the grieving son, it all evaporated, leaving behind a man who was nothing more than a hollow shell of greed. He looked at Michelle, and for the first time, there was no affection in his eyes, only a sharp, jagged contempt. "You were so easy, Michelle," he spat, his voice dropping the polite facade. "You were so desperate for the perfect life that you didn't even notice when the bank accounts started draining. You wanted to be the martyr, the nurse who saved everyone. So I gave you someone to save. I gave you a dying mother and a struggling husband, and you ate it up. You loved the struggle. It made you feel important." I moved toward him, my hands balling into fists, but Michelle put a hand on my chest. She stepped toward Brandon, her head held high. "I didn't love the struggle, Brandon," she said. "I loved you, or at least I loved the person I thought you were. But that person doesn't exist. You're just a ghost in a suit." She turned to Amber. "You might want to check your own credit, Amber. If he's anything like the man I know, he's probably maxed out your name, too." Amber looked like she was going to be sick. She looked at the crumpled cars, the middle-aged man in a flannel shirt, and the woman in a robe who was actually the wife she didn't know existed. The reality of her own ruin began to settle in. "He took my inheritance," Amber whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the Mercedes's radiator. "He said we were investing it in the Belize property. $50,000. What happened next was the final crack in the foundation. Brandon realized the police I'd mentioned hadn't arrived yet. He saw a window. He bolted. He didn't go for the Audi. It was pinned by Amber's car. He ran for the side of the house where his motorcycle was kept under a tarp. "He's getting away," Amber screamed, lunging toward him. But she tripped over the debris of the crash. I started to run after him, but the sound of tires screeching onto the quiet suburban street stopped everyone in their tracks. 3 dark SUVs, real police this time, swerved into the cul-de-sac, blocking the exit. But they weren't the fraud unit. 4 men in tactical gear jumped out, and they didn't head for Brandon. They headed for the front door of the house. "Federal agents," one yelled. "Stay where you are." I grabbed Michelle and pulled her behind the pillar of the porch. Brandon was frozen by his motorcycle, the tarp half off. Amber was still on the ground, sobbing. I looked at Marcus, who climbed out of the lead SUV. He wasn't wearing his tan coat anymore. He was wearing a windbreaker with letters on the back that made my stomach drop. FBI. "Marcus?" I yelled, my brain struggling to keep up with the shift in the landscape. "What is this?" Marcus walked toward us, his face grimmer than it had been at the diner. He didn't look at me. He looked at Brandon, who was being forced to the ground by 2 agents. "Sorry about the deception, Walter," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the quiet morning. "I'm not a private investigator. I'm with the Interstate Financial Crimes Task Force. We've been tracking the Coleman Group for 2 years. But it wasn't just about the real estate fraud." He looked at the house, then back at me. "Brandon wasn't just stealing from your daughter and his mistress, Walter. He was laundering money for a cartel out of Juarez. This house? It wasn't just a home. It was a drop for digital currency keys. That family trust he had Michelle sign. It wasn't to sell the house. It was to transfer the deed to a known money laundering front." I looked at Michelle. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape. She had been married to a man who wasn't just a liar and a cheat. He was a cog in a machine of international crime. "Wait," I said, the engineer in me finding the flaw. "If the house is part of a federal investigation, what happens to Michelle?" Marcus looked at the ground, then back at my daughter. The pity in his eyes was the worst part. "That's the problem, Walter. Because she signed those trust documents, the ones Brandon told her were for his mother, she's legally listed as the managing director of the shell company. On paper, she's the one who authorized the transfers. On paper, she looks like the mastermind." The cold I'd felt all morning turned into a deep, soul-crushing frost. Brandon had done more than steal her money. He had built a cage around her and handed her the bars, making sure that when the roof fell in, she'd be the one trapped under the rubble. I didn't know it yet, but my daughter was 20 minutes away from being arrested for crimes she didn't even understand. Brandon, pinned to the driveway with his face pressed against the asphalt, looked up at us. Despite the handcuffs, despite the agents, he started to laugh. "I told you, Walter," he wheezed, a bloody grin stretching across his face. "I'm a liquidator, and I've just liquefied your daughter's life." As the agents moved toward Michelle with a pair of handcuffs, I realized that my revenge had backfired. In trying to expose him, I'd triggered a trap that was designed to destroy the only person I had left in this world. But as my hand went to my pocket, I felt the small, cold shape of the flash drive Agent Marcus had given me at the diner, the one he told me to keep safe, just in case. "Wait," I shouted, stepping in front of the agents. "You have the wrong person, and I have the blueprints to prove it." The air in the driveway was thick with the smell of scorched rubber and the metallic tang of crushed machinery, but it was nothing compared to the cold, clinical efficiency of the federal agents. Two of them moved toward Michelle, their faces devoid of emotion, their handcuffs gleaming with a dull, silver light that seemed to suck the warmth out of the morning. "Michelle Coleman, you are being detained as part of a federal investigation into money laundering and wire fraud," one of them said. Michelle didn't scream. She didn't even move. She looked like a statue carved from salt, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. The betrayal had been a physical blow, but this the realization that her own signature, given in love and trust, was now the rope they were using to hang her, was the final collapse. "Wait!" I yelled, throwing myself between my daughter and the lead agent. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest, but my voice stayed low and steady, the voice I used when a bridge support was failing, and every second counted. "You don't understand. She's not the mastermind. She's the victim of a long con. I have proof." Agent Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "Walter, I like you, but I have a job to do. The paper trail is a mile long. She signed the wire transfers, she signed the trust. Her name is on the Cayman accounts." "Because he told her it was for his mother," I roared, gesturing toward Brandon. "He used her grief as a blindfold, but he forgot one thing about engineers, Marcus. We don't just look at the surface. We measure the stress on every single bolt." I pulled the silver flash drive from my pocket. It was small, cold, and felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "When I started suspecting him last week, I didn't just hire a private investigator," I said, my eyes fixed on Brandon, whose sneer was beginning to falter. "I knew this house. I helped build the additions. I know every crawl space, every vent, and every dead zone in the Wi-Fi. I installed a secondary, hardwired security system in the office 6 months ago when Brandon claimed he was worried about competitors breaking in. He thought he was using my skills to protect his secrets. He didn't realize I kept the master override." Brandon's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent green. "On this drive," I continued, holding it up like a holy relic, "are 3 months of high-definition audio and video from that office. It's not connected to the cloud. It's a closed-loop system. It has every conversation he had with his associates. It has him laughing about how easy it was to get the nurse to sign the shell company papers. It has him walking her through the forge points of the notary seal, and it has the real keys to the digital currency wallets he's been using for the cartel." The lead agent looked at Marcus, who nodded slowly. They took the drive, and for 5 minutes, the world was silent except for the hiss of the Mercedes radiator and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. They plugged it into a ruggedized laptop in the back of an SUV. I looked at Michelle. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and glassy. I wanted to hold her, but I knew that if I moved, the agents would tackle me. I had to stay perfect. I had to stay a pillar. "Walter," Marcus said, looking up from the screen. His voice was different now, less like a hunter, and more like a man who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle. This changes the scope. He's on tape explaining the entire laundering structure to someone named El Gato. He's literally bragging about framing his wife. He's lying," Brandon screamed, struggling against the agents holding him. "That's a deep fake. He's an engineer. He knows how to manipulate digital files. He's trying to save his brat." "It's hardwired, Brandon," I said, stepping closer to him until I could see the sweat beads on his upper lip. "No internet connection. No timestamp manipulation. It's raw data. You were so busy looking at the horizon that you didn't see the trapdoor right under your feet." The agents didn't unhook the cuffs from Brandon, but they did step away from Michelle. They didn't arrest her, but they didn't let her go either. "She still has to come with us for questioning, Walter," Marcus said, his tone softened. "The evidence is strong, but the money is still gone. 140,000 in debt, the inheritance vanished, and the house is technically tied up in a federal seizure. Even if she's cleared of the crime, she's still left in the ruins." That was the moment I hit rock bottom. I watched them lead my daughter to the SUV. She didn't look back. She looked like a ghost walking toward her own funeral. Amber, the mistress, was being loaded into another car, her designer coat stained with oil and tears. Brandon was tossed into the back of a van, still cursing, still trying to spin a lie that no one was buying anymore. I stood alone in the driveway of the house I'd helped build, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 cars and 1 family. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. I walked back into the house, the door clicking shut behind me. The lemon tarts were still on the tray. The orange juice was still soaked into the table. The family trust papers were scattered on the floor like dead leaves. I sat at the table and put my head in my hands. I'd saved her from prison, but I couldn't save her from the aftermath. She was bankrupt. She was homeless. The legacy her mother had worked 30 years to build was in the hands of the federal government. I felt like a failure. I'd seen the cracks, but I'd let the building collapse anyway just so I could catch the man who pushed it. I looked up, my eyes blurry with tears, and saw Sarah's rose sitting in the vase. It was starting to wilt, the petals curling at the edges. I reached out to touch it, and my hand brushed against Brandon's laptop, which the feds had somehow missed in the initial chaos, or perhaps Marcus had left it for me. A silent thank you for the flash drive. It was password protected, but Brandon was arrogant. He thought he was the smartest person in any room. I tried Michelle's birthday. Nothing. I tried his own name. Nothing. Then I thought about the one lie he'd told more than any other, the one he'd used to bleed my daughter dry. I typed in, Edith Haingin Lehaimui. The screen flickered and opened. I didn't find more cartel secrets. I found something much more personal. I found a folder labeled Insurance. Not for the house, not for the cars. It was a life insurance policy Brandon had taken out on Michelle 6 months ago. The payout was $2 million. And then I saw the browser history. He hadn't just been looking at Belize. He'd been searching for untraceable paralytics, accidental falls in nursing environments, and insulin toxicity in non-diabetics. My stomach turned to ice. He wasn't just going to leave her. He was going to kill her. He was going to frame her for the crime, let her suicide under the weight of the federal investigation, and collect the payout in a foreign account. The revenge I had planned suddenly felt too small, too kind. I sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, the engineer in me starting to draft a new blueprint, a plan that didn't just involve the police or the FBI. A plan that would hit Brandon where he truly lived in his own cowardice and his fear of the people he worked for. I realized then that Brandon had made one fatal error. He'd assumed I was a man of the law. He'd assumed I wanted justice. He didn't realize that when a bridge is beyond repair, you don't try to fix it, you demolition it. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd seen on the flash drive, a number Brandon used to text his associates. "Hello?" A voice answered, cold and sharp. "I'm calling about Brandon Coleman," I said, my voice as hard as granite. "He's currently in federal custody. And he's been telling the FBI everything about El Gato to save his own skin, including the location of the offshore cold wallets." There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end. "Who is this?" the voice asked. "Just a concerned father-in-law." I said, "I thought you should know that your liquidator is currently leaking like a sieve. If you want your keys back, you might want to move fast." I hung up, my heart racing. I had just put a target on Brandon's back that the feds couldn't protect him from, but it wasn't enough. I needed to make sure Michelle got back what was hers. I looked at the insurance policy on the screen. There was a secondary clause, one Brandon had overlooked in his haste. Because the policy was funded with stolen money, and because the beneficiary had been changed via a forged document, the entire policy was technically void, unless the primary victim of the fraud, Michelle, claimed the premiums back. But there was a way to redirect the payout of the shell company's liquidated assets. I spent the next 4 hours at that computer, using every ounce of my technical knowledge to reroute the digital signatures I'd found on the flash drive. I wasn't stealing. I was re-engineering the flow of the stolen funds back into a trust that Brandon couldn't touch, a trust in Edith's name, a real, living Edith. I'd found her in the digital sweep. She wasn't his mother. She was a woman in a nursing home in Florida whose identity Brandon had stolen years ago. A woman who was currently being evicted because her pension had been drained by an unknown relative. What happened next was the first step of my true revenge. I drove to the federal building where they were holding Michelle. I didn't go to the front desk. I waited in the parking lot for Marcus. When he emerged, looking exhausted, I intercepted him. Marcus, I said, I need one favor, a big one. Walter, I've already done enough for you today. Your daughter is being cleared, but she's losing everything else. There's nothing left to do. There is, I said, leaning in. Brandon has a secret account, one he was using to hide the insurance money he was going to collect after he disposed of Michelle. Marcus froze. Disposed? I handed him the printouts of the browser history. He read them, his face darkening with every line. That son of a bitch, Marcus whispered. The cartel is going to come for him in jail, Marcus. You know that. He's a dead man walking. But before he goes, I want him to know one thing. I want him to know that the money he worked so hard to steal didn't go to Belize. It went to Florida. To the real Edith. To the real Edith, I said. And the rest? The rest is going into a shielded account for a certain nurse in Highlands Ranch, as a consultation fee for assisting in a federal investigation. Marcus looked at me for a long time. He should have arrested me. He should have told me to go home. But he looked at the photos of the insurance policy. Then he looked at the building where my daughter was currently sitting in a cold room, and he nodded. I'll see what I can do with the paperwork, Walter, but the cartel part, that's on you. Oh, the cartel part is already moving, I said. But as I turned to walk away, Marcus grabbed my arm. Walter, there's one thing you should know. We did a final sweep of the Audi. We found a notebook in the hidden compartment of the trunk. And it wasn't just Michelle and Amber, Walter. There were 4 other names. 4 other nurses or teachers in 4 different states. He wasn't just a liquidator. He was a franchise. The scale of the evil was so much larger than I'd imagined. Brandon wasn't just a man who had made a mistake. He was a machine that destroyed women for sport. And that was when I realized my plan had one flaw. If Brandon survived the night, he'd find a way to do it again. I looked at Marcus. Where are they holding him? County jail. Processing. Why? I just want to deliver a message, I said. A family message. I didn't know it yet, but the message I was about to deliver would be the final twist in a story that had already cost us everything. And it started with a visit to a very specific flower shop. I didn't go home. I didn't go to the hospital to check on my blood pressure, which was screaming behind my eyes like a tea kettle. I went back to the King Soopers on Wadsworth. I walked into that store with the same squeaky-wheeled cart, passing the same aisles where my world had first begun to tilt. I went to the floral section and bought another dozen red roses. Long-stemmed, thorns intact. The cashier looked at me, the same tired woman from Sunday, and smiled. Back again. She must really love those flowers. She does, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. But these aren't for her. I drove to the Jefferson County Jail. The building was a brutalist block of concrete and regret, sitting under the shadow of the foothills. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't have a lawyer. I just had a visitor's pass and a bouquet of roses that felt like a bundle of switches in my hand. Because I was still listed as Brandon's emergency contact in the system, a final, ironic oversight in his meticulous planning, they let me through. I sat behind the thick plexiglass of the visiting booth. A few minutes later, the heavy steel door on the other side opened, and Brandon was let in. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit or his Tag Heuer watch anymore. He was in an oversized orange jumpsuit that made him look small, sallow, and pathetic. His face was bruised from where the asphalt had met his skin during the arrest, and the arrogance I'd seen in the driveway had been replaced by a frantic, darting desperation. When he saw it was me, he lunged for the phone on his side, his hands trembling. "Walter, you have to get me out of here," he hissed into the receiver, his voice a ragged whisper. "Those agents, they don't understand the business. It's all a misunderstanding. If you bail me out, I can fix this. I can get Michelle's money back. I have a secondary account they didn't find. 200,000, Walter. It's yours if you help me." I didn't pick up the phone at first. I just sat there, looking at him through the glass. I'm an engineer. I've spent my life looking at the way things are put together. And looking at Brandon now, I saw the ultimate structural failure. He was all facade, all hollow spaces, and cheap materials. There was nothing load-bearing in his soul. I slowly picked up the receiver. "I brought you some flowers, Brandon," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I held the roses up to the glass. "Red roses. Michelle's favorite, her mother's favorite. I thought you should have them, to remember the family you thought was so easy to destroy." Brandon stared at the roses, then back at me. "I don't give a damn about flowers, Walter. Did you hear me? 200,000. I'll give you the routing number right now. Just get Marcus to drop the laundering charges. You're friends with him, right? Tell him it was a mistake. Marcus isn't my friend, Brandon. He's a federal agent, and the laundering charges are the least of your worries. I leaned in closer to the glass, my shadow falling over him. I found the insurance policy, and I found your search history. The frantic light in his eyes flickered and died. He pulled back from the glass, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That was just a joke, he stammered. A dark joke. I would never have actually. I don't care what you would have done, I interrupted. Because you aren't going to have the chance. You see, Brandon, I spent the last few hours doing some engineering of my own. I looked at the offshore accounts you were using for the cartel, the ones you thought were so secure. Brandon's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles were white. What did you do? I didn't steal the money, I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. That would be illegal, and I'm a man of the law. No, I just pointed the money back to where it belonged. I found the real Edith Marshall in Florida, the woman whose life you've been using as a skin suit for 6 years. I've already contacted a lawyer in Tampa. By tomorrow, your Belize fund will be paying for her 24-hour private nursing care and a new roof for her home. She's going to live like a queen on your liquidated assets. You can't, Brandon gasped. That's my exit. And the rest, I continued, ignoring his protest. The rest is being held in an escrow account for the victims of financial predation as part of the federal seizure. Michelle won't get it all back. The government takes its cut, but she'll have enough to pay off the debts you saddled her with. She'll be at zero, Brandon. But zero is a lot better than the grave you had dug for her. Brandon started to scream then, a high-pitched, keening sound that brought the guards to the door. He began pounding on the glass, cursing my name, cursing Michelle, cursing the world for not being as gullible as he'd hoped. You've killed me, he shrieked. Do you have any idea what those people will do to me when they find out the money is gone? I have a pretty good idea, I said. In fact, I made sure they knew exactly why the money was gone. I sent a message to El Gato. I told him you were trading their digital keys for a lighter sentence. I told them you were the one who invited the FBI to the house. Brandon's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent blue. He stopped pounding on the glass. He just stood there, his eyes wide with a terror so deep it looked like he was already staring into the abyss. You signed my death warrant, he whispered. No, Brandon, I said, standing up. You signed it yourself 4 years ago, when you decided to break my daughter's heart. I just made sure the ink was permanent. I hung up the phone. I left the roses on the small ledge outside the booth, a splash of red against the gray concrete. I walked out of that jail, and for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't know it yet, but the final message had been delivered. But the house I'd built for Michelle wasn't finished. There was one more piece of the foundation that needed to be laid. I went back to the federal building. Michelle was sitting on a wooden bench in the lobby, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her lawyer, the one I'd hired an hour ago, was talking to her, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at her hands, the hands that had worked so many shifts to fund her own destruction. When she saw me, she didn't run to me. She just looked up, her eyes empty. He's gone, Dad, she said, her voice a flat, dead monotone. Everything is gone. The house, the money, the life I thought I had. I'm 35 years old, and I have nothing but a mountain of debt and a name that's tied to a cartel. I sat down beside her and took her hand. It was ice cold. You have me, Michelle, and you have the truth. Everything else is just wood and stone. We can rebuild wood and stone. We're engineers, remember? I'm not an engineer, Dad. I'm a nurse, and I couldn't even see the rot in my own home. Sometimes the rot is behind the drywall, sweetheart. You can't blame yourself for not seeing what someone spent years trying to hide. I walked her to my truck, and as we drove back to my house, the house where she'd grown up, the silence between us was different. It wasn't the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a construction site after a storm, the quiet before the first new brick is laid. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a black car parked across the street, not an SUV, not a police car. A sleek, black sedan with tinted windows. It had been there when I left, and it was still there now. I felt the old prickle of sweat at the base of my neck. I'd sent a message to the cartel to destroy Brandon, but I'd forgotten one basic rule of structural engineering. When you take out a main support beam, You have to be careful that the whole roof doesn't come down on your head." I didn't say anything to Michelle. I ushered her inside, locked the door, and told her to go upstairs and rest. I watched from the window as the black car sat there, its engine idling, a low, ominous hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I grabbed my phone to call Marcus, but the screen stayed black. No signal. Then, the power in the house flickered and died. What happened next was the one thing I hadn't planned for. The sound of the front door being kicked open didn't come from the front. It came from the back, the kitchen, the same place where we'd had the celebratory breakfast that morning. I stood in the dark of the living room, my heart hammering, as three figures moved through the kitchen. They weren't wearing tactical gear. They were wearing casual clothes, but they moved with a lethal, coordinated grace. "Walter Green," a voice called out the same cold, sharp voice from the phone call. "We aren't here for Brandon. We're here for the keys he said you were holding." I realized then that Brandon had told one final lie. He'd told the cartel that I was the one who had the money. He'd made me the target so he could survive the night in jail. I looked at the stairs where Michelle was. I looked at the dark kitchen, and I realized that the family revenge was only half over. I'd taken Brandon's life, but now I had to save ours. "Michelle!" I yelled, my voice echoing in the pitch-black house. "Get to the crawl space, now!" But as I turned to face the men in the kitchen, a fourth figure stepped out of the shadows behind me, and the last thing I felt was the cold, hard press of a gun against the back of my skull. The cold, circular pressure of the gun barrel against the base of my skull felt like a final, unyielding period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. In that pitch-black living room, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the three men in my kitchen and the frantic thrumming of my own heart, which felt like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of ribs. "Don't move, engineer," the voice behind me whispered. It was a sandpaper rasp, devoid of any human warmth. "Brandon said you were the one holding the keys. He said you were the smart one, the one who redesigned the flow." I stared into the darkness of my own hallway. I could hear the floorboards upstairs creaking. Michelle was moving. She hadn't made it to the crawl space yet. If she came down those stairs, she was dead. If I stayed silent, we were both dead. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing my engineer's brain to override the primal scream of my nervous system. I needed to stabilize the structure. I needed to find the load-bearing lie and pull it. "Brandon lied to you," I said, my voice remarkably steady for a man staring at his own grave. "He didn't give me any keys. He gave me a death warrant, and he gave you a distraction so he could buy himself an hour of safety in a federal holding cell." The pressure of the gun increased. "We don't like distractions, Walter. We like results." He told us the digital signatures for the cold wallets were hidden in the blueprints of this house. He said you built a physical firewall into the very foundation. I almost laughed. It was the perfect Brandon lie, taking my real-life profession and weaving it into a fantasy that sounded just technical enough to be plausible. He'd told these killers that I'd hidden millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency within the literal walls of my home. He'd turned my sanctuary into a treasure map to save his own skin. "There are no blueprints," I said, "and there is no money in these walls. But there is a silent alarm triggered the moment you cut the power to this block. You didn't just walk into a house, you walked into a federal perimeter." "He's bluffing," one of the men in the kitchen said, his silhouette illuminated briefly by the ghost light of a passing car outside. He started pulling drawers out of the sideboard, dumping Sarah's silverware onto the floor with a rhythmic, metallic clatter. "I don't bluff," I said. "I calculate." And I calculated that Brandon would try to sell me out the moment Agent Marcus put him in the van, the black sedan outside. "It's been identified. The FBI is 3 minutes away, and the only thing you're going to find in this house is a life sentence." The man behind me hesitated. I felt the gun barrel waver for a fraction of a second. That was all the structural weakness I needed. "Michelle, stay where you are," I roared. In that instant, the front door didn't just open, it exploded inward. But it wasn't the FBI. A flashbang grenade detonated in the entryway, a blinding white sun that turned the darkness into a searing, high-pitched scream. I dropped to the floor, covering my head, as the living room was flooded with the rhythmic twip, twip, twip of suppressed gunfire. I didn't know it yet, but the black sedan hadn't been the cartel, and it hadn't been Marcus. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in my ears faded to a dull roar, I looked up. The 3 men from the kitchen were on the floor, incapacitated. The man who had held the gun to my head was pinned against the wall by a figure in a dark suit. Marcus stepped into the light of a tactical flashlight, his face grim. He wasn't wearing his FBI windbreaker. He was wearing civilian clothes, but his eyes were as hard as the diamonds Brandon had used to buy Amber's silence. "You okay, Walter?" Marcus asked, holstering his weapon. "You're late," I wheezed, pushing myself up from the carpet. "Where's Michelle?" "Right here, Dad." Michelle appeared at the top of the stairs, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes flashing with a fierce, newfound strength. She wasn't holding a white flag. She was holding my old heavy-duty pipe wrench from the upstairs toolkit. She looked like she was ready to dismantle the world herself. Marcus looked at the men on the floor, then back at me. The black sedan was a scout team for El Gato. We intercepted their comms 20 minutes ago. Brandon didn't just tell them you had the keys, Walter. He told them you were a retired cleaner for a rival organization. He wanted them to come here and burn the house down with you in it. He figured if the house burned, the evidence on that flash drive burned with it. The depravity of it finally hit me. Brandon hadn't just wanted me dead. He wanted the evidence of his crimes turned to ash, even if it meant his wife and father-in-law died in the flames. He had been willing to commit double homicide from the safety of a jail cell just to keep his liquidator reputation intact. "Where is he?" Michelle asked, her voice cold. "Where is Brandon?" Marcus looked at his watch. "He's being transferred to a maximum security facility in Florence, but there was an incident during processing." "An incident?" I asked. "One of the inmates in the holding cell was a cousin of a man Brandon defrauded 2 years ago. A teacher whose pension disappeared into one of Brandon's shell accounts. It seems word travels fast in the Jefferson County Jail." "Is he dead?" Michelle's voice didn't waver. "No," Marcus said. "But he'll never walk without a brace again, and he'll never use that charming face to sell a house again. The state has enough on him for 20 years, and the feds have enough for 40. He's gone, Michelle. Truly, finally gone." We stood in the wreckage of my living room, the silverware scattered, the door off its hinges, the smell of cordite hanging in the air. The family revenge was over, but the cost was visible in every crack in the walls. Marcus and his team cleared the bodies and the scouts, and within an hour, the house was swarming with real, uniformed police. They took our statements, processed the scene, and eventually, the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a long, pale light across the driveway where the 2 wrecked cars still sat, locked in a metallic embrace. What happened over the next 6 months was the hardest part of the blueprint. We didn't stay in that house. I sold it, and Michelle sold her property in Highlands Ranch, what was left of it after the federal liens were cleared. Marcus kept his word. Because of the evidence on the flash drive, the government acknowledged Michelle as a victim witness rather than a co-conspirator. They didn't take her nursing license, and they didn't take her freedom, but they couldn't give her back her $25,000, and they couldn't give her back the 4 years she'd spent loving a phantom. We moved to a small, quiet town in the mountains, a place where no one knew the name Brandon Coleman. We bought a modest cottage with good bones, a structure I personally inspected from the floor joists to the roof shingles. Michelle went back to work at a local clinic. She's quieter now. She doesn't trust easily, and she doesn't wear jewelry. But every Sunday, she comes over to my place, and we sit on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the pines. One Sunday, about a year after the arrest, Michelle arrived with a small, rectangular box. She sat down across from me and pushed it over. "I found this in the safe deposit box I finally got the bank to release," she said. I opened it. Inside was Sarah's pearl necklace. It had been missing since the day Brandon cleaned out the house before the feds arrived. He hadn't sold it. He'd kept it in a separate box, labeled leverage. "I thought about throwing it in the lake," Michelle whispered, "because he touched it, because he used it as part of his perfect husband costume. I picked up the pearls. They were cool and smooth, the same as the day I'd given them to her mother. Don't let him take this too, Michelle. This isn't his. It never was. These pearls represent 30 years of a real marriage. A marriage built on a real foundation. He was just a squatter in the house of your life. He's gone, but the foundation is still yours." Michelle took the necklace back, her fingers tracing the curve of the pearls. For the first time in a year, I saw a genuine smile touch her lips. Not the tired, desperate smile of the nurse who was trying to save everyone, but the smile of the woman who had finally saved herself. As for Brandon, I hear he's become a legend of sorts in the federal system. Not as a mastermind, but as a cautionary tale. He spends his days in a library, trying to find legal loopholes that don't exist, while the El Gato associates he betrayed ensure that every day he spends behind bars is a living hell. The liquidator finally ran out of assets. I've learned a lot about structures in my 68 years. I've learned that you can't build a skyscraper on a swamp, and you can't build a life on a lie. But I've also learned that even the most shattered building can be reclaimed. You just have to be willing to clear the debris, find the original blueprints, and start over, one brick at a time. I looked at the red roses sitting in a vase on our new porch. They were fresh, vibrant, and full of thorns. "You know, Dad," Michelle said, looking out at the mountains, "I used to think the truth was a lighthouse, something you just followed. And now?" I asked. "Now I think the truth is a hammer," she said. "It breaks everything you thought was real, but it's the only tool you can use to build something that actually lasts." I nodded, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. The structure was finally level, the bridge was finally secure, and for the first time in a long time, the Green family was home.